So my name's Morgan. I work in the bee lab here at the University of Minnesota, and I study honeybees and honeybee foraging behavior. So that's basically behavior that bees do in order to collect food as efficiently as possible. And in particular, I'm really interested in, people want to restore prairies in the Midwest, but we don't know how much honeybees will use them and how much they'll benefit from them. So I'm trying to sort of understand how attractive different species of native prairie flowers are to honeybees. And so that's kind of my work, and I do different things. I take samples of the food that they collect, and I try to ID the pollen and figure out where it came from. And I also look at waggle dance communications between foragers, and I try to map where they are, what places in space they're advertising to their sisters. So.
I'm Alan. I'm also with the bee lab. I work in the native bee research area of the bee lab, and I'm also interested in the prairie restorations here in the Midwest. What I'm interested in is how good certain bees are at pollinating certain plants. So depending on the plant and when the plant's active, certain bees might be better pollinators. And how good a bee pollinates, or if the best pollinator is missing, could affect how the plant reproduces or grows in the future, which could change what the prairie looks like. So I'm interested in sort of studying the mutualism between plants and their best pollinators.
Thank you. So Evie wants to know, what are the least and most effective types of pollinators?
Well, bees are very effective pollinators, and the reason that they're really effective pollinators is that they have hairs that are actually branched, so they catch pollen really well, and that's why bees get totally covered in pollen often when they go to flowers, and so they are much more likely than many other insects to take that pollen from one flower to another. But that doesn't mean that other insects aren't important pollinators. Some flies are actually really important pollinators for certain flowers, but they tend on average to be less efficient, I guess, pollinators. Wasps similarly can pollinate things, but they're not hairy, and they don't have the same kind of branched hairs all over them that would carry the pollen. Or not, you have other...
Yeah, it depends on the flower too. So certain flowers have co-evolved with certain pollinators to sort of create a mutualism where, say, only a butterfly will effectively pollinate or hit the receptive surface of a flower. Or like birds, there's also lizards who pollinate certain flowers. So that can also affect who's most effective.
Yeah, or like bumblebee with buzz pollination. Some flowers have to be vibrated in order to pollinate them, so the pollen won't come out of these little pores unless a bee that vibrates the flower at the right frequency comes along.
Oh, cool. Alrighty, so this next question is from Joseph, and he wants to know, how many flowers do honeybees pollinate per day?
So that's a really good question. There are articles that will give you estimates of how many flowers of different species a honeybee will pollinate, and I don't know off the top of my head what those numbers are. It really depends, on how much nectar each flower is providing, and so that will determine how many flowers a honeybee visits. And of course, each plant will have different numbers of flowers on it. Some plants only have one flower, some have hundreds and hundreds of flowers. So it's a really great question, but I can't really answer it exactly.
It's probably a lot, though, right?
Yes. No. So if you watch a honeybee out in a garden somewhere, you'll see that they don't just go to one flower and go home. They go to many, many, many flowers, and usually they don't go to all the flowers on one plant. They actually go to a few of them, and then they move to another plant, and then they move to another plant, and they have these sort of patterns that they go through big patches of flowers.
Neat. Alright, this next question is from Shane, and Shane wants to know, what are your favorite pollinators?
I really like squash bees. Squash bees, they found that males are often the best pollinators of squash flowers because they sleep in the flower, and in the morning when the flower opens up, the little bee warms up, wakes up, goes around the flower, visits a new one, and deposits pollen. So there's lots of pictures on the internet of little squash flowers opening up and these tiny bees all huddled up in them.
Oh, that sounds cute.
I also really like cactus bees. They do a similar thing where males sleep in cactus flowers, and both males and females are very good at going into the cactus flower and making sure they go all the way around and hit all of the pollination surfaces in it. It's also really cool.
Neat.
Those are cool. I was gonna say squash bees too. Well, of course, I study honeybees, so I love honeybees. I think they're really awesome in terms of their social structure, but in terms of pollination, fig wasps are really interesting pollinators. So they actually depend on figs for their reproduction, and the figs create these reproductive structures that all of the flowers are actually inside this big ball, and then the figs go in, and then I always forget the whole cycle, but the females actually mate and have to lay their eggs on flowers in another fig, so they pollinate the figs through that process, and the figs actually can't reproduce sexually without that one species of pollinators. So they figured that out in California a while back, that they weren't able to have figs that needed to reproduce sexually because they didn't have the wasps, so they had to bring in the wasps.
So neat. Thank you. This next question is from Julia. Julia's really interested in birds, and she wants to know, aside from hummingbirds, are there other types of birds that pollinate?
So we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, there are several. A lot of them are in tropical ecosystems. There's quite a few in Mediterranean ecosystems, like I guess the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece. What was the one we were talking about? Honey creepers.
Honey creepers,
will-
yep.
It's all very dependent on what the beak looks like, so it might even be a finch that does it too. They tend to have longer beaks, sometimes hooked, something to be able to stick into the corolla, the little basin of the flower where the nectar is. If you Google bird pollination, I'm sure you'll find lots of cool pictures.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's the limit of my knowledge.
No worries. Thank you. This next question is from Caleb, and Caleb wants to know, why do pollinators eat nectar instead of fruits or small vegetables?
So that's a really great question. So fruits and nectar are kind of similar, actually, in a certain way, in that in both cases the plant is actually trying to attract certain animals to eat this resource, so that they'll do something for the plant. In the case of fruit, it's usually moving the seeds from one place to another. In the case of nectar, it's moving pollen from one place to another. But they're targeting different animals, right? So bees and other pollinators have evolved with flowers over time. So probably what happened first is they started using pollen as a resource, as a protein source, but then over time the plants started realizing, this is anthropomorphizing the plants, but over time the plants started producing secretions that would enhance their fitness, would allow them to be more successful at getting their pollen from one flower to another, because the pollinators would start coming. And so it's the same thing with fruits, that certain animals maybe were already around these plants, and then they start to eat some of the nutritious material around the seed, and then the seeds are better transported, and so those plants do better, and over time that gets more and more developed into a more complicated structure. So that's not maybe the best answer, but that's the one I have.
Yeah, I guess to add to it, what we do know about bee evolution is that long, long ago, they were, whatever organism they sort of originated from was very similar to a wasp. Possibly carnivorous in that it eats other insects, possibly was drinking nectar like lots of wasps do today. And then over time, like Morgan was saying, they started exploiting nectar more and more. And then you can look in the fossil record, and there's lots of articles on it. All of a sudden there's this huge explosion in numbers of flowers, different types of flowers, millions and millions of years ago, and that's around where we think bees started really taking off and adapting to just using flowers for their source of food, because it wasn't really used. So it was kind of an open space for them to occupy and get lots of food from.
And one thing to note about generalist bees, that they actually will eat lots of things if they're just available out there. Like there are cases where machina cherry factories that have this sort of syrup, they didn't protect it well enough, and honeybees came in and the beekeepers noticed all this red stuff in their combs. So
is that like the bees that got into the M&Ms?
Yeah, like that. So if you had a bunch of fruit juice, they might drink
Okay.
it.
Cool. Hey, this next question's a fun one. It's again from Evie. Could you cure a bee that's been zombied?
So we were talking about bees that have parasite loads.
Right, so when a bee gets infected by a parasite or a parasitoid and its behavior becomes affected, a lot of times in social bees like honeybees or bumblebees, particularly with bumblebees, it's been shown that bees start leaving the nest and sleeping outside to avoid infecting others. And so far as we know, there's no real way to cure that sort of infection. Once a bee is infected, it's just going to get sicker and sicker until it passes away, spreads the disease. But then with Varroa, I'm not sure how it works with honeybees or their parasites, or Cryphidia.
Yeah, I don't know as much as I should. There's a kind of fly that seems to change the behavior of bees so that they fly at night. But I can't remember the details of that. Yeah, in order to cure a bee of something like that, you'd have to have a lot of people interested in researching drugs to deal with those particular parasites, and there really isn't the money.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, now I have a couple of questions for you guys too to round this out. In the news a lot we hear about that a lot of pollinators are in trouble. What are some of the big problems that are facing pollinators today?
You can sum them up as there's not enough habitat for them to nest at, there's not enough food, there's not enough flowers for them a lot of times, or there's not enough flowers at the right times of years, because not all bees are flying all summer. Some are only flying early spring, some are only out foraging right before fall hits, so food throughout the year is something that's very important. And then chemical inputs into their habitat. So you hear a lot about pesticides, but there's also fungicides, and insecticides are really bad for them, we know. And then herbicides, they can all sort of interact, and that's not very well studied. So those are sort of the big three that I can think of. Do you have any others?
Did you mention diseases?
No, I did not.
Sure. So disease is a big problem. It's something that we're learning more about with pollinators in general, but we know a fair amount about it with honeybees. So honeybees face a lot of different disease stresses. They have bacterial diseases, especially diseases that affect young larval bees in the nest. So that makes a lot of sense because it's a dark, humid environment. It's warm all the time, so lots of things grow really well in honeybee colonies. But in addition, and probably a worse thing, is varroa mites. So varroa mites are these little mites, but for a bee they're actually quite large. They're like having a hamster sucking your blood. And they came originally from Asia. So the honeybees in Asia can deal with them. They react to them very quickly, and so the mites never become a very big problem for Asian honeybees. But for honeybees in the US and in Europe and in lots of other places in the world, they really can't deal with them. So they get to levels that are really way too high, and they spread viruses. So that's the big thing, is they spread things like deformed wing virus, which is a virus where when the bees emerge, their wings are just totally deformed and they can't fly, and they have other problems. So that's a big concern, and a lot of research is going into trying to deal with varroa mites so that they won't spread these diseases. And then, of course, there's some concern that because of the spread of diseases maybe from honeybees to other bees, or from bumblebees that are brought in to pollinate to other species of bumblebees, that diseases are getting out into other populations of bees too. So things like you were talking about
Nosema and Cryptidia basically make the bees really sick and dehydrated, and they will die. And yeah, they think that is part of the reason why so many native bumblebees have declined so drastically over the past, few decades, is because these diseases were brought in from, I think, Europe or Asia with Nosema, and then left on the flowers basically where other bumblebees will pick them up. But it's a pretty interesting and new area of research. People are hopeful will help us understand a bit more about these diseases.
A lot of the students in our 4-H online adventure are really interested in perhaps one day becoming entomologists themselves. And so I wanted to ask you, how did you get interested in entomology, and especially in studying pollinators?
You want to go first, Morgan?
Sure. So I guess I've always been interested in animal behavior. From the time I was a little kid, I liked watching animals do things and wondering why they did them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, insects are very easy to watch for long periods of time. You have ants on your front driveway, and you can watch them for hours and put out food for them and see what they do. But I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and I knew that I was interested in biology, so that's what I majored in college. And then my senior year, I wanted to do a research project, and so I ended up, fortunately, the person who was my mentor came that year, and she studies honeybees. So I did a project on honeybee behavior, and in particular on honeybee waggle dancing. So that's this behavior that honeybees use to communicate with each other about where really great sources of nectar and pollen are. And I really fell in love with the idea of honeybees society that are communicating with each other and doing all these amazing things. And so I just decided, okay, I'm then going to apply to programs for grad school where I can keep working with honeybees. And so that's what I did.
Awesome.
I was also really fascinated with animals and would spend lots of time poking around anthills with a stick and catching beetles in my yard. I stopped thinking about insects for a while, but knew I wanted to major in biology and kind of wanted to stay with animal behavior. And then on the flip side, I was really interested in ways we can conserve and preserve all the beauty and habitat and ecosystems we have around us. So as I became interested in that, I was able to, my senior year of college, find a lab who was interested in these big questions of how do we conserve ecosystems, and they just so happened to work with native bees a lot in pollination. So I got thrown into a field team and and I also wanted to work outside. That was another big component. We started working with surveying native bees, and I got interested in why bees interact with certain flowers, and that kind of led to a project, some research, a paper, and then I decided I really wanted to keep working with habitat conservation for pollinators, because they do a lot of important things for ecosystems and then our food industry as well. And I was able to find the Bee Lab here at UMN, and the state of Minnesota is really interested in preserving habitat for not only insects but waterfowl, deer, and just conservation in general for all the unique ecosystems up here. So that's kind of what inspired me to be a scientist, was the conservation biology side.
Nice. All right, I have one last question to wrap things up. If you had to pick one fun fact about pollinators that you thought was the most interesting one, what would that be?
Bees nest everywhere. Solitary, so not honeybees and not bumblebees, although they do nest in lots of different environments and have different nest types. Most other species of bee, a major pollinator, are really particularly adapted to certain nesting types. So if you have holes in a log, certain bees will go into the hole or dig their own hole and patch it up with certain materials like bits of leaf or hair off of plants. They're called carder bees, and make little woolly blocks,
Oh, neat.
blobs for their eggs. There's digger bees who like to dig little holes, and you can see them poke their head out and poke back in.
Aw.
A lot of them defend their nests. What's another cool one?
I heard there was even a bee that could nest in volcanoes.
Yes, there is a particular species. A small group of them, one population, ended up colonizing this island volcano in an uninhabitable zone. So in an uninhabitable zone, there's acid rain, it's really warm, the soil's pretty poor quality, so there's not much else alive, except for one flower species that happens to thrive there. So this soil nesting bee species has established nests in this awful volcano, this awful volcano area, and they're the only ones, and they only focus on this one flower because it's the only flower there.
Wow.
So yeah, bees can be very tough as well.
Nice.
So there are a lot of fun facts, but I guess I'll pick one that I think part of the fascination about pollinators is that they like flowers and we like flowers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, flowers are these showy, amazing structures that are trying to get pollinators to be attracted to them and to land on them, but they actually see flowers differently than we do. So bees can see UV, but they can't see red light. So that's different than us. Their whole color scheme is sort of shifted from ours, and in some ways it's entirely different because the colors that you see are made up of basically signals to your brain from 3 types of receptors. So how much each type of receptor is excited is going to tell you that's green or that's blue or whatever color it is. And so for bees, it's 3 different receptors. It's the UV, it's sort of blue-green and yellowish. And so we really don't know exactly what flowers look like to them. We do know, though, that there are patterns that we can't see on flowers. So for example, dandelions, you can look this up online too and see sort of images that people have created to try to approximate what a bee might see that are called nectar guides. So basically the outside of the flower is a different color to the bee than the inside of the flower, even though to us it's entirely just a big blob of yellow. And that tells them where the nectar is going to be on the flower. So that's
Neat.
kind of cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think that's all we have time for now for the interview, but I want to say thank you so much again for sharing your knowledge with us.